Everybody, a very warm welcome to the first of our public lectures. This is a series of lectures where the Architecture, Planning and Landscape School in the university invite very well-known academics or journalists or public commentators to really offer really cross-cutting insights into the nature of cities, the nature of place, the nature of architecture and landscape that are hopefully very relevant to academics, but also to a much wider set of communities in Newcastle and the northeast. Before I introduce today's speaker, I should introduce myself. I'm Stephen Graham. I work in the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape with a group of other colleagues who help organise this series. I should thank Anne Fry very much for all her efforts, because all of this comes together because of Anne's work, basically. And I should also stress that you're all very warmly invited to the other events that we have lined up for this academic year. Just to give you the heads up on some of the speakers we have coming. On the 23rd of November, we have David Schlossberg, who's based in the University of Sydney, an expert on climate change. And David's going to be talking about climate justice and adaptation as cities face the rather terrifying prospects of intensified climate change. So that's a very interesting and relevant lecture. On the 9th of February, next term, we're going to have a very well-known urban researcher who's done perhaps more than anyone else to bring together a sort of global perspective of cities. This is Anthony King, who's had a long association with University of California, Berkeley, and also State University of New York. He's now based in the UK. He's an emeritus professor. And Anthony King is going to be talking about New York, London, and New Delhi. So a very warm invitation to Anthony. 15th of March, I know it's a long way off, but do sort of put this in your diary if you can. We have Richard Sennett, one of the world's most well-known sociologists, very well-known collaborator with many people at LSE. He's going to talk about the architecture of cooperation. And the final one we have lined up this session is from Eric Parry, who's a very well-known architect, who's going to talk about architecture and ambiguity. So a warm invitation to all of those events. Let me now introduce our first speaker, Anna Minton. Anna, it's a great pleasure to welcome Anna to Newcastle again. She's got a long-standing affiliation with the city and was actually born in Newcastle. Many of you will have seen Anna's journalism and her work for the RSCS, and she does a lot of journalism about the nature of cities, but has earlier experience working as a foreign correspondent and gaining loads of journalistic awards. But I think in terms of this talk, it's worth just stressing how Anna's critical take on how British cities are changing, particularly in terms of land ownership, privatisation, security and control, is having a really, really massive following, because I think Anna's work is one of the few in the sort of public world of British cities which is starting to ask big questions about what British cities are for, who are they for, and what are the politics of how sort of post-Blairite cities are being transformed. So Anna's done a lot of work on this in The Guardian. She's done lots of television work, radio work, but most importantly perhaps, she's the author of a book called Ground Control, Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City, which is very widely read and very widely available, and currently in preparation for a new edition which will engage with the whole issue of the Olympics. So we're delighted to have Anna here today, and I will shut up now and hand over the microphone to Anna. Thank you very much.
Hi, is the lapel? Yeah, it's working okay. Right. Thanks very much, Steve, for that generous introduction. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the main themes in the book, which Steve just introduced to you. It was published in 2009, quite a few years ago now, quite a different context. although not as different as we might wish. And I've just written a new chapter on the Olympics, which is going to be coming out in January in a new edition. So I will discuss some of the issues around that as well. So this is the book. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, my background is as a writer and a journalist. This is my first book. I'm a contributor to The Guardian, and I work for a range of policy organisations such as Joseph Rowntree and Reba. And actually one of the reasons I left journalism, because I think it's fair to say that I I made a conscious decision to move away from journalism, was because I found daily journalism very, very frustrating. You couldn't really do much with the pressures of time deadlines and really sort of lack of resources. It sort of constantly felt like you weren't really getting to the bottom of anything. So I went to work I started to write reports for think tanks and policy organisations, which would sort of, made me feel I was actually sort of finding something out. And while I was doing that, I came across lots of what I considered to be very, very good stories. And I had real trouble getting them published. Newspapers like The Guardian actually weren't very interested in a lot of the stories I'm going to outline in this talk. This is in the height of the Blair period and the property boom era. It was very hard to get any attention on this sort of take on things. And then I managed to get a book deal with a commercial publisher, Penguin, and it was that book actually which enabled me to get those stories out there. So the reason I'm just sort of starting off with this story is to just tell you, actually it's very hard to have a debate aired in the media. There are a lot of constraints there, and I think that's actually relevant to some of the conversation that we're going to have. Very different context from when I first thought of writing the book. The first line of the book is that it was conceived in a boom and written in a bust. When I first had the idea for the book, at the height of the property boom, I thought that the privatisation of the city, which is the central theme of the book, was this sort of inexorable. There was nothing that we could do about it. It was the only way things were going to go. And I thought actually it was going to be quite a gloomy, apocalyptic book, and the only thing I could do with it was just point out what was happening, and hope that by raising a debate, people might start to understand some of the issues that lie beneath. But then, midway through writing the book, the financial crisis happened. Boom turned to bust, and actually there was a feeling of optimism around, crisis is opportunity, we can't go on as we are, and actually the book ended really on a surprisingly positive note, and I do have a final chapter there where I look at alternative approaches to the city, and I really put a lot of work into that. It wasn't supposed to be a sort of tacked on the end, 2 or 3 pages. It was really sort of part of the overall thesis. So actually it was quite an optimistic ending. So now here we are in nearly 2012, and I've just written this new chapter focusing on the Olympics. And where are we now? Well, sadly, it seems that most of my optimism really wasn't justified, because not only are we back to business as usual, well, the hope is that we're going to get back to business as usual, but actually, as I'll talk about, some of the trends which I've been describing have become even more extreme. But on the flip side, I think there is more genuine debate out there now on these issues, so I think that's a very positive thing. Just to say a little bit about the tone of the book. What I'm writing about are often considered very specialist subject areas, familiar to many of you in the room, but subjects which rarely reach a mainstream audience, obscured by the jargon of planning and Section 106 and housing. But I felt that these are absolutely central issues to the way we live, the way we feel about ourselves in the city, and yet that debate wasn't being had. And I put here, it's obscured obscured by jargon and the technical silos which grow up around these areas, and actually a failure to really sort of join the dots and have a sort of much more multidisciplinary approach. So that was my aim, to mix an investigative journalism approach with academic research, not on the whole original research of mine, but I really sort of immersed myself in the academic debates and tried to bring those two together and thereby have a debate which would appeal to mainstream audiences, because these are such vital subjects, and yet there had been so little discussion about that. Well, I'm talking to a university audience, so I'll just say very briefly, so where does that leave me vis-a-vis the academy? I'm not an academic, but actually it's quite an academic book. But it's supposed to be written. It's I was very careful to reference, footnote, everything. But it is written in an accessible style. Well, I think I'm very glad to say academics seem to like it. I talk a lot at universities. It has on the whole been very welcomed, and I think that's very positive, because I think it's very important to have a dialogue between some of the many really important debates you have, but actually which don't seem to get the sort of airtime that they really need. So what are the key themes of the book? Well, the underpinning theme really is the post-industrial change. I've said here the post-industrial opportunity. Well, it has been an opportunity, and this talk really is going to be about what we've done with that opportunity. So post-industrial change, which heralded the new economy, and that brought with it this increasingly polarised environment and the so-called two-speed economy. Really, I'm talking about regeneration. What is this term, regeneration, which we've heard so much about in the last 15 years or so? Really, it's a property-fueled approach to development, which is underpinned by debt, which, I'd say in large part is what's brought us to the situation that we're in today. And I've described it as the architecture of boom and bust. I'm also talking about issues of identity, place identity, homogenization, why does everywhere look the same, and the sterility of places, exclusion and inclusion, and this growing culture of fear and crime complex in contemporary society. And the argument of the book is actually that this growing culture of fear is created in some part by the sort of built environment we are living in, which is fostering a growing lack of trust and cohesion. How did the book come about? Well, it came out of that work I did when I switched from journalism to longer reports. And I did a series of 3 reports, many of which were published by the RICS, and the middle one, which was actually based on Newcastle, called Northern Soul, was also published by Demos. The first, Building Balanced Communities, looked at the pattern of gated communities and ghettos in the US and questioned to what extent that was coming over to Britain. And when I wrote that, we were absolutely flabbergasted by the level of publicity that report got. And it was really clear, actually, that, I'd struck a chord with that. So that really sort of spurred me on to continue looking at this theme. And Northern Soul looked at polarisation in British cities, focusing specifically on Newcastle. And because it was a collaboration with Demos, which was a very new Labour think tank at the time, they really wanted me to do it to tell the story of creative regeneration, which we were witnessing in Newcastle with the Baltic and, sort of your bid for capital of culture, etc. And I mean, we had a few debates really about how that report should come out, but I spent a lot of time up here looking at that. And actually, while I was up here, and I was holed up in Newcastle Library, reading various journals and, trying to get to sort of the bottom of these subjects, I came across Splintering Urbanism, which is Steve's book. That's the first time I'd come across it. And he has a section in the book where he talks about business improvement districts in America, which I will go on to talk about in a minute. And I was just reading this, section about the privatisation of public space through business improvement districts. you know, and I'd just been hearing about business improvement districts. It was 2003, and business improvement districts were just coming over to Britain. And I was just reading this as a journalist, and I just thought, this is an amazing story. And nobody knows about this. You know, private space, public space is in fact being privatised. So that was the impetus really for my next report, which focused on the privatisation of public space. And it was those three pieces of work together which formed the basis of the book proposal for ground control. So the main theme of the book is the privatised city. So what am I talking about? Well, this slide actually is of the centre of Liverpool. This picture was probably taken in about 2007 when I first started writing the book, and it's a sort of image that characterised so many British towns and cities in the centre of the boom years. Huge construction sites all over the country, in very large city centre sites like this, but much smaller sites as well. This is the post-industrial opportunity. You know, I'd come out of the train at Manchester, and you know, you could hardly hear yourself for the noise of cranes and the amount of cranes over the Manchester skyline, building places like this and all those apartment blocks, which are such a sort of defining characteristic of those new Labour years as well. So this became Liverpool One, which some of you might be familiar with, which is this very large privatised city centre, open air shopping mall with private streets and private public so-called public places, 43 hectares, 34 streets in the centre of Liverpool, entirely private, owned by the Duke of Westminster. But as I say, it's large sites and small sites. There are places like Liverpool One, Cabot Circus in Bristol, High Cross in Leicester, but much smaller sites like this. This is Cardinal Place, which is just behind Victoria Station in London, owned by Land Securities. Just a sort of it's a sort of relatively small little sort of infill site. And you know, the sort of typical architecture of this sort of place, quite an empty sort of feeling. You know, quite a sterile environment, I think, is sort of being captured in this photograph. And this is another private place. This is in Liverpool also, but it's not Liverpool One. It's actually across the way from Liverpool One, because what you're starting to see in the city now is separate private enclaves. And what's really I don't know if this has got a point thing. What's very typical of these places is that they'll have these bollards separating the privatised space behind from the rest of the city. And there's a little sign up there which says private property, and there'll be a list of a few of the things that you're not allowed to do there, although certainly not all of them. And this is called East Village, and these places have these very sort of Americanized sounding names like East Village or The Village. What I found particularly unbelievable really, actually, that in Manchester, York Street had actually changed its name to New York Street, which just shows you where this was going. So at this point, people quite often say to me, well, you know, yes, but private ownership of places was behind some of our some of our finest urban fabric. And in fact, the Georgian terraces and squares of parts of London and other cities, including Newcastle, you know, these would never have come about if it wasn't for the private ownership of the old aristocratic landlords. You know, and of course this is absolutely true. But what you do not see in this slide, which is in London, I think it could be Bedford Square, is the gates and the sentry boxes and the private security which surrounded this at the time that it was built. This was entirely private space. There was no public access whatsoever. And in fact, and London was full of these sort of enclaves. And what you saw is that as local government rose in power during the 19th century, there was a series of, there were huge public protests which resulted in a series of parliamentary inquiries, so that by the mid-19th century, actually there was a really big groundswell of opposition to these public places, to these private places. And what it resulted in by the end of the 19th century is that various acts of parliament were passed which ensured that henceforward streets and public places would be adopted by local authorities, and that these places would no longer be private enclaves. So when I first started writing the book, I had this just sort of assumption, which I think a great many people share, which is, you know, streets are public. That's just what they are. And in fact, that's not the case, and that hasn't always been the case. Having public streets and public places has been an achievement of the growth of democracy. And what we've started to see in the last 10 years is that this process has started to go into reverse. And that has got very, very big implications, not just for the health of our cities, for the sort of the pleasure we get from our cities, but for democracy. So, the privatised city, well, essentially, it's two models which have really become more and more the way that we're doing things today. The first of these models is just the private ownership of places, the slide I showed you of Liverpool 1 and Cardinal Place. What that has seen is that the sort of Canary Wharf model of the city, Canary Wharf and the Broadgate Centre, built during the late 80s. These were the first privately owned places, the first major privately owned places in the UK. But these were finance districts built to reflect the needs of finance and built in the image of finance. At the time, they were exceptional places. What you've seen is that this has become the template for all new regeneration all around the country. Now, alongside this, we've got the model of private management of places which may still be in public ownership, because after all, although this is the template for all new regeneration, of course most of the city isn't new. So we have this model of private management coming in, and this is the business improvement district model, which has been imported directly from the US. And a very big theme of the book actually is how we have imported one American policy to the city after another. You know, what I'm talking about is not the result of some sort of process of globalization that, you know, is inevitable and we simply can't control. Actually, our politicians very deliberately went over to the US and cherry-picked a series of policies, and they've had a very radical effect on our towns and cities. Underpinning all this is the economic model, which is best known to people in the industry as property-led or retail-led regeneration. And this is the property-fueled model of development, where architects and planners may once have been the leading players in new development. Now developers are absolutely at the helm, and architects and planners really are there to sort of, you know, to fit in with the requirement of the client. And really what this has resulted in is a very different idea of the city, which sees place primarily as a product. And as I said, it's not as democratic an idea of the city, and it segregates places into enclaves. And the main aim is to keep property prices and land values high, and that's what's driving it, rather than the notion that we used to have, which was that the public good would be driving new development. And that's been reflected in a change in planning legislation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And another point I want to emphasise is that this privatising of the streets is new. We've only been seeing it in the last 10 to 15 years. And very often people might say to me, well, you know, if Grosvenor or some other big property developer is going to invest, you know, £1 billion in the centre of a city, if they require to have private ownership of the streets, isn't that sort of fair enough? You know, they've got to have some return on their investment. And I think that's absolutely a misunderstanding. Private investment does not require private ownership of the streets, and of course the private sector invested in city centres, consistently over the last couple of generations, as they do in the rest of Europe. And this notion of private ownership is not a quid pro quo, and it isn't for developers either. Yes, very often they do like it, very often they're encouraged by it, but it's not. It's policy rather than the property industry which is actually pushing for this, and it's also local authorities who are keen to offload financial responsibilities for the public realm. But as the public realm is on the cusp of what the democratic process really is all about, it's something that we need to look at very, very seriously. So what's the impact of treating place purely as a product? Well, the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre said, I think more than 40 years ago now, that if you treat place purely as a product, then the result will be that everywhere will come to look the same. And that's what we've started to see. And there's growing public disquiet over that. You've all heard about the research and reports on clone towns and non-places and Anywheresville, UK. People don't like this. At the same time, you're seeing the growing private security environment created. CCTV over every inch of the site, I was proudly told, in Liverpool 1. Defensible architecture. An environment that, again, I'm going to go on to talk about in more detail, but I think that really sort of is bringing with it its own culture, which is very different from the public culture and public life of the city that we're used to. And I think it creates a far more fearful atmosphere, a less spontaneous one. There are so many rules and regulations in these places, ranging from, the seemingly innocuous, no skateboarding, no rollerblading, no cycling, depending on, your interests. Some of you might find those less innocuous than others. But actually, no filming, no photography, no political demonstrations. It's a very different idea of understanding the city. So what lies behind it? Well, as I said, it's not the inevitable result of globalization. It is the direct result of a handful of specific policies. And one of the chief ones is planning and compulsory purchase legislation. And that's what you need to create these enormous sites, 43 hectares in Liverpool, 170 acres in Stratford City. Stratford City is really the jewel in the crown of all these developments. Now, in the US, compulsory purchase is called eminent domain. And in America, in 2005, their legislation was changed following a Supreme Court judgment in a very similar way to ours. Ours was changed according to the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, that even the planning academics among you might not be that familiar with. And basically that undermined the role of the public good as a benchmark test for new development and replaced it with economic benefit as the benchmark test. Now, as I said, very similar thing happened in America at about the same time. We didn't copy the States in this. These trends were coming at the same time. It actually happened a year later. And this Supreme Court judgment, Kello v. London, removed the public good from legislation in a similar way. But what was the reaction in the US? It led all the news bulletins. There was a national outcry over it, and protesters actually camped on the White House lawn, leading former President George Bush to intervene personally in the issue. And the consequence was that a great many American states revoked the legislation. Now, over here, the same change to the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act was barely noticed. So while a lot of my book is discussing how we have picked a series of policies from the US. Actually, what's also really notable is that while a lot of these policies are very controversial over here, they've been passed without a murmur and with no debate. So, what's all this leading to? Well, my argument, as Steve said in the introduction, is that it's really changing patterns of land ownership, and it's creating these enormous sites, which actually are more similar than anything else to pre-Victorian, pre-democratic patterns of land ownership, when the dukes and earls carved up the city between them. And that's very different from the last 150 years, which has seen a diverse patchwork of ownership from local authorities, private individuals, and institutional investors. But now we have a single private landowner owning and controlling the whole of a centre of a city. And that landowner is invariably a property multinational. The Duke of Westminster being something of an anachronism, still being an aristocratic landowner who is in charge of a property multinational. But and my argument would be that this change in land ownership actually is very, very key in undermining the diversity of the city, the diversity of the high street, and in undermining democracy. And I think this is a passage which puts what I'm trying to say very well. And it's written by an architect, Adam Caruso, in a piece called The Emotional City. And he wrote this in 2003, so that was, before this process had taken off. So, how much more relevant is it now? While planning authorities may argue about facade materials and the survival of medieval street plans in the master plan, several city blocks that once housed thousands of tenants and was in the ownership of hundreds are now controlled by one owner backed by international finance institutions. Do not be fooled by the medieval street pattern, the well-maintained squares, the lunchtime activities. These developments constitute a serious erosion of democracy and the public realm. This process is taking place all over London and in all major cities. And that was in 2003 he wrote that. So, alongside the privatised places model, we have business improvement districts, which, as I said, is a policy directly imported from the US. And actually, it's a policy which few people have debated over here, but is very controversial in the US. When Boston tried to introduce a business improvement district, there were citywide protests. And it's the subject of pretty vociferous debate, actually, with various neocon commentators being massively in favour of business improvement districts. And I mean, I don't want to sort of characterise it as a sort of neocon policy. It isn't. But actually, in America, the debate is really alive over the issue. In a way it just isn't here. So what are business improvement districts? Well, basically, the business improvement district is a private company which local businesses, normally retailers and others, pay a service charge or levy, in other words, a tax, to fund the improvements in the area that they wish to see. So the Business Improvement District Company will argue that this, in fact, is a very sort of innovative policy, which is basically improving local areas. But of course, the improvements are the ones which the big retailers want to see, and they're underpinned by a set of principles which come from a management approach. Maslow, who's Abraham Maslow, key management guru, who was writing in the 50s and is sort of the guru of management since then. It's based on his hierarchy of needs, and underpinning that pyramid hierarchy is the need to keep places clean and safe. What clean and safe actually translates as is high security and very high levels of sanitation. So, all of these state-of-the-art cleaning machines that you see, and uniformed cleaning attendants alongside the uniformed private security guards. And marketing is also very, very key to business improvement districts, bringing in more visitors to places with the guiding principle to improve the bottom line of an area, i.e. the profitability of a place. And these often overlap with the private parts of the city, because very often a business improvement district will be set up to manage the private place. So it's very difficult to know who controls what in this map of private ownerships of the city. So, I mean, you know, clean and safe. I mean, who wouldn't want the city to be clean and safe? It sounds like a very good idea. Who would want a dirty and dangerous city? But, you know, behind this very good narrative, there's a story which is not quite so straightforward. And as I said, this comes directly from US policy and guidelines issued by the New York Mayor's office. And I think I've gone through these. I mean, basically security, visible uniform private security, CCTV, marketing, branding, and this pristine cleanliness. I spoke to somebody who was involved in developing one of the Olympic projects, and he said that he hoped that parts of Stratford City would come up to the standards of any office lobby, which really, you know, seems to me to be a bizarre aspiration for a busy city centre street. But that's where the obsession with cleanliness has got us. And one of the problems with this is that very often this approach can clean out the people as well, and all the interesting activities, which leads to this sort of bizarre paradox, because actually the point of the business improvement district or the management company running these areas is to create exciting places. And yet, you know, the places seem to be sterile. So what do? Well, you know, in discussions I've had with them, they say, well, we import excitement, you know, and we audition buskers. So we get this sort of very choreographed city landscape created. Now, alongside all of these policy developments, we've seen changes in criminal justice policy as well, and the growth of private security, which came again at the behest of legislation and David Blunkett's Police Reform Act of 2002, which introduced this notion of the wider police family. Which is private security who can now receive accredited status, and they have the powers to issue various fines. And they basically have much more authority in the landscape than they did. So this wider police family of wardens, rangers, ambassadors, those sort of uniformed officials that I'm sure you've all started to notice. And this has overlapped exactly with the introduction of business improvement districts. Then we've also had the antisocial behaviour agenda, which, if I'll say one nice thing, and it probably will be the only one nice thing about the coalition government, is at least some of the previous government's respect and antisocial behaviour policies have been diluted, because that was a huge agenda with very disturbing civil liberties ramifications. We've also had terrorism legislation very often trotted out as a reason for why all this growing security is necessary, and the growing use of stop and search. In parts of London, stop and search was basically just renewed on a sort of blanket, as a blanket policy. So what's the impact of private security? Well, you know, the underpinning argument of my book is that it adds to sterility, and rather than making us feel safer, it in fact makes us feel more frightened. And, you know, in a way, that's a sort of no-brainer. You know, if there's security all around you, you know, clearly there's something to fear. But it's a very difficult issue, and security is a very hard topic, actually, to get to the bottom of it. It's an emotional issue, and it's a psychological issue. And very often when people are asked, you know, would you like more security, they see it as a bonus, because they think, well, you know, more security will make me feel safer, so surely that's a good thing. So more security generally is a very popular domestic policy. More CCTV, all sorts of security. It shows that something is being done. But there's a paradox at the heart of security, which is that the more you have, the less it should be necessary. But I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that it doesn't work like that at all. There's another paradox as well, which is that actually crime has been going down in this country since 1995, including violent crime. And I really tried to get to the bottom of these figures, so I'd have a sort of, you know, a really strong case on that. And, you know, I think I'm happy that I have done that. So I'll just, you know, if anyone wants to raise any specific details of violent crime, because it's a contentious issue, I think we can say it has been going down. But fear of crime has continued to soar. And the police call this the success paradox. So actually a lot of these security solutions have been introduced specifically to address that paradox. You know, while policymakers know it's not about crime, because crime has been going down, but we've got to solve this problem of fear of crime. Well, you know, it's really the wrong way of doing things, and the solutions are very much part of the problem. And you just see this sort of, you know, self-perpetuating cycle which just gets more and more extreme. So just to give you some images of what we're talking about. This is a particularly uniformed security guard at Canary Wharf. You know, some of them are a bit more sort of downbeat. But this is a sort of chap that, you know, patrols these private places. I'm sure you must have some in Newcastle. I'm not actually too familiar with them, but I'm sure you must have some. This slide is a bit of a joke slide. It's actually taken just outside the Greater London Authority building in London, which is owned by More London, which is, well, no, it's managed by More London. I haven't got the name of the property company which owns the space off the top of my head, but it's an entirely private place. So the seat of democratic government in London is run in this way. And an architecture magazine called Blueprint decided to set up this spoof, and basically this woman here pretended that she was having a picnic just outside the GLA building, and you can see, you know, the outcome of just sitting in this public space, what that led to. Alongside the city centre developments, we've had the growth of security in the domestic environment as well, and just the normalisation of gating properties. You know, gated developments are actually no longer the preserve of the super wealthy, far from it. In fact, in some parts of the country, nearly all new development is on a gated model. So this is a sort of typical sort of city centre apartment style gated development, and there'll probably be security guards somewhere, and there might be a sentry box, and you know, you're all familiar with, you know, this is increasingly the way developers are building housing. CCTV, well, you know, we have the most CCTV in the world. We have more than the whole of Europe put together, 4.2 million CCTV cameras. You know, in the absence of any evidence that CCTV reduces crime, the government actually was spending 70% of its crime prevention budget on CCTV, because it's largely a popular policy which is relatively cheap, and it's seen to be doing something. And actually, that sort of camera, very old-fashioned now. You know, there have been lots and lots of innovations and sort of super high-tech cameras of all kinds. And sort of innovations like this, I don't know if you have them in Newcastle, but these are very common in London. This sort of quite sinister sort of Dalek car. This is a CCTV car, and it's patrolling around to watch out for particularly parking crimes. And then this is the Mosquito. I don't know if you've come across that. This is a device which can be put up in public spaces to discourage antisocial behaviour, specifically young people congregating, because it emits a high-pitched whine at a frequency that only young people can hear. So basically anyone over 30 is unlikely to be affected, but for young people this high-pitched whine makes them feel sick. And this has been a controversial device. I mean, when I first started writing the book and I first started talking about these things, people were really, really shocked. I mean, it's banned in various other countries for contravening human rights. But I think people have started to sort of become aware of it. But in fact, the company which produces these, it's a Welsh company. This isn't an American import. We've invented it. The company that produces these has been so successful, it's been bought up by an American company which is launching them worldwide. And these are drones which you may have started to hear about. This is flying CCTV, which is increasingly being used by British police forces. This is the adaptation of military technology for civilian uses, which Steve has written a lot about. And drones will certainly be used to police the Olympics. And of course, the security legacy of any Olympics or big event like that is that actually the security isn't temporary just for the event. It's trialled, piloted, and once it's been used for the spectacle event, it's there to stay. So drones, although they're not that common yet, they're going to become a definite a permanent feature of our security landscape. So really what I've been trying to say with all of this is that this growing obsession with safety and security that basically comes with private places, that creates more fearful places. And part of the reason for this is that it undermines our personal and collective responsibility for each other. This Jane Jacobs' idea of natural surveillance, which keeps people safe. You know, this sort of unconscious interaction between strangers that we've all felt when we walk through a busy place. That's what keeps a place safe. But actually all this emphasis on external controls is undermining that. And it's actually diluting trust between people. And I mentioned before, you know, the problem is soaring fear of crime, not actual crime itself. The thing is, fear of crime doesn't correlate at all with actual crime, but it does correlate directly with trust. And I think Denmark provides a very salutary comparison in this instance, because Denmark has very similar levels of crime to the UK, according to the European Crime and Safety Survey, which is shown to be a consequence of urbanisation, a large population of young people, and a binge drinking culture. But Denmark, the happiest country in the world apparently, also has very low levels of fear. Now, you know, there are other factors at play as well, but this sort of high security environment that I've been describing is anathema in Denmark, where open street CCTV is actually banned. So that's my sort of gloomy picture. You know, when I first wrote the book, I thought, you know, this was the landscape we've been creating, and certainly this is the landscape that we're going to continue to be creating. But, you know, then we had the financial crisis, and really it's raised huge questions about the economic viability of this model. Whatever else you may think about it, it is no longer economically viable. You know, this is the architecture of boom and bust. So, you know, I thought, and many other people thought, that we had an opportunity to start thinking about alternative ways of doing things. Because after all, you know, this is the sort of picture that you're going to see now. This is the centre of Bradford, where Westfield, who have built Stratford City, which is part of the Olympic development, they were planning another massive private place in the centre of the city, 23 hectares, and it's just a hole in the ground. And, you know, it's far from the only one. All of these places have come to an end. This model has stalled. But what are we doing? Well, you know, actually, we're not only going ahead, we're going ahead with the jewel in the crown, you know, the sort of the daddy of all of these, at a particular point when we absolutely cannot do it. The Olympic Park, 500-acre park, Westfield, Stratford City, 170 acres, all the things I've just described to you in terms of, well, the size, in terms of the security, you know, all of these have reached their high point with the Olympics. And yet the economic rationale has completely collapsed. And in fact, when the government had to bail out the banks in 2008, the government also had to bail out the Olympics because, of course, the point of this sort of development was that the private sector, the property developers, were going to raise the money, or if you want to look at language slightly differently, they were going to borrow the money from the banks to do this. And of course the model has collapsed, the banks are bankrupt, you know, not lending any money. So the government bailed out not only the banks but the project and put £5.7 billion of extra public funding into the Olympic development because it's the Olympics and it just couldn't be seen to fail. And I think they were also pretty desperate to get Westfield built. So we've got a total budget of £9.3 billion for the Olympics. And actually 2% has come from the private sector. But what the government did is, although the private sector, Lend-Lease were the property company building much of the Olympic development, Lend-Lease could not borrow the money, but the government basically are paying Lend-Lease. The government is paying for the development, and they're also paying Lend-Lease to build it. So Lend-Lease are just fine. And Westfield, who are building the shopping centre, which is the biggest shopping centre operator in the world, massively profitable company. The government has also given quite a lot of incentives to the tunes of hundreds of millions extra to Westfield to make sure that they didn't renege on the deal. So, you know, who benefits from all of this? What is it leaving us with? Well, really, what it's leaving us with, and this is the story I've been looking at recently for the chapter I've just finished on the Olympics, is a story of a small group of players who all know each other, who all go back a long way, really not dissimilar to a lot of the other stories that you're seeing in various other parts of our politics at the moment, with a total lack of transparency and accountability, enormous involvement of lobbying companies as well, I might add. So the Olympic Delivery Authority is run, well, he's now left to run Network Rail because he did such a good job, is now run by David Higgins. Well, David Higgins was the former chief executive of Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease is the property company which built Blue Water. Well, Westfield Stratford City, what's Westfield Stratford City? It's essentially a blue water inside the city. So really, it's this. What you've seen with the Olympic development is this small group of people, small group of companies who basically are quids in on the whole thing. Lend-Lease are also building the Olympic Village in the Olympic Park, and the Olympic Park is called the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and it's been trailed as the first royal park for 200 years. But it's not a royal park. There was a local campaign, actually led by the mayor of Newham, for it to be a royal park. But it's not going to be a royal park. It's an entirely private park, or I should say, it's actually going to be a series of private places on this privatised model. And you've probably heard about the sort of debacle just recently over who's going to own the stadium. Well, you know, that just sort of shows you, you know, how difficult it is to manage something holistically when it just results in all these complex private ownerships. And the Olympic Village itself has been sold to the Qatari royal family, although the Wellcome Trust put in a really interesting bid for 7,000 social housing units, 2 universities, a bid which would see the profits of the village ploughed into the park. That was just rejected because it didn't apparently offer good value to the taxpayer, i.e. the bottom line wasn't there, i.e. the Qataris offered more money. So, you know, although this commercial approach to every part of the city has resulted in such an appalling mess, there is no ability to look at anything in a different way at all, you know, which I find sort of fairly staggering. Also, I found this quite scandalous. I came across while I was researching the Olympics. When we got the Olympics, it was really critical to get local support for the bid because Olympics, you know, depend on local support for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to choose the winning city. And actually, the Mayor of London, Lord Coe, and the London Development Agency signed an agreement with a conglomeration of local groups in East London, led by London citizens. And this agreement promised jobs, affordable housing, the building of a construction academy, about 6 pledges of you know, sort of really worthwhile things which were going to be delivered to the community. And when the ODA came into existence, the Olympic Delivery Authority, they completely refused to honour this ethical Olympic pledge, and their reason was that it is illegal to dictate the terms of contracts struck under open tender. So, I mean, you know, I found this sort of fairly scandalous, but also the fact that none of us had heard of it, you know, that received hardly any coverage whatsoever. Now, you know, if we had a planning system which put the public good at its centre, this sort of hiding behind this sort of legalese to justify this approach just would not have been possible. And the affordable housing pledges have not been met at all. That's absolutely at the centre of the supposed legacy. And if you do hear politicians talking about the Olympic Village, they will repeatedly say to you that it's going to provide lots of affordable housing. Well, you know, what is affordable housing? I haven't talked much about housing in this presentation, but I talk about it a lot in the book. And it's a key part of the privatisation of every part of the urban environment. And the definition of affordable housing, well, it's kept changing since council housing was effectively privatised. It morphed into social housing and affordable housing. And now affordable housing has changed again recently under the coalition government. In fact, affordable housing is now housing which costs 80% of market rent. So, I mean, if you live in London, you know, that's not even remotely affordable for anybody on a low income. So, I mean, the reason I'm talking about this is because I wanted to contrast the Olympic development of Westfield, Stratford City, the huge high-end shopping centre, and the private Olympic Park. I wanted to contrast this with really what's happening for most people on the ground in Newham, which is one of the poorest parts of the UK. And actually what's really happening for most of them is the further privatisation of housing and the housing benefit cuts which are going to come into play in April 2012, which is actually going to have a very big effect on boroughs like Newham, which are going to become home to which are going to basically become ghettos of poverty. I mean, I won't go into the details of why, because of course housing benefit changes are also so complex as to be barely comprehensible. And I've talked to Shelter about this, you know, and when they talk about the affordable housing pledges, which really is at the centre of the sort of payoff to the community, you know, they just say, you know, the people running the Olympics, they're just living in another world. You know, they have absolutely no idea. So really, you know, I wanted to write about the Olympic development because it's really the sort of, it's the apogee of this sort of absolutely segregated pattern that, you know, we saw sort of beginning, sort of, you know, 15 years ago with the sort of beginnings of a two-speed economy, but it could not be, well, I mean, I suppose we really saw it beginning with Docklands, but it couldn't be starker than with the Olympics, which are just round the corner from Docklands. And, you know, as I said to you, not only has, well, Olympics apart, this model of development is bust, you know, it's halted. The Olympics only went ahead because they were bailed out. But actually, what are we seeing instead? Well, actually, we're seeing a model that is arguably even more worrying than what I've just described to you, which is the rise of so-called Tesco Towns, where entire communities are being planned, centred on a Tesco's superstore, because it is mainly Tesco's, which is particularly interested in this model, where they will build hundreds of homes, a school, facilities, and, of course, the streets and public places. It's a subsidiary of Tesco's called Spenhill, so you won't have heard very much about it because it's not part of the marketing that the company wants to promote. But this subsidiary of Tesco is planning district centres. Actually, one in Gateshead is being planned, in Kirkby, West Bromwich, Bradley, Stoke, Shepton Mallet, Seaton in Devon, Bromley by Bow, Woolwich, Streatham. You know, this is the next wave of development, and it's been condemned by CABE before CABE was abolished as really, you know, being sort of something to really worry about. I mean, the question is, you know, should it be Tesco who is now, you know, the deciding voice in creating the new parts of our built environment? I think one of the really big issues is this concept of social silence. You know, why haven't we had these discussions here? You know, why have these policy changes been really controversial in the US and they've galvanized debate over there, and yet over here, these central policy changes to specifically planning legislation, but also the introduction of policies such as business improvement districts. You know, they've had hardly any debate, and it's this whole idea of social silence, where people, you know, sort of don't really talk about, you know, what they shouldn't really talk about. And that's why I wanted to say at the beginning how difficult I found it to get most of the stories I've talked to you about published in The Guardian. Once the book came out, yes, I wrote about all of these things in The Guardian, but actually at the time when New Labour was at its height, it was very, very difficult to get publicity for this. So it's a combination of this social silence and the jargon of all of these policy areas, these technical silos. Well, why are they so filled with jargon? You know, one of the very big reasons that they are so incomprehensible is that the process of privatisation, what it does is it creates this multitude, this sort of bewildering array of quangos and companies and agencies and government organisations, so that sort of, you know, really nobody can understand what's going on, and which is very similar factors to what happened with the banking crisis, and you know, that obscures the process, and that's really very helpful actually for the process. So, you know, what solutions? Well, you know, I think understanding what's going on is one of the most important things. And in that sense, I think what I've seen since the book came out has been encouraging, because, you know, there is much more of a sense of a debate around these issues. So I think, you know, understanding what's going on is the first thing. But I think we need legal tools. You know, if the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Authority, can hide behind the legalese of saying they won't honour this ethical pledge because it is illegal to dictate the terms of a contract struck under open tender. Well, you know, if the planning system is a legal process. You know, if the public good was put back into the planning system as the benchmark test for new development, I think that would have, you know, a really significant effect. You know, it was taken out, well, it was put back in the US, but we still aren't debating this at all. You know, in the whole planning localism debate, which has had enough column inches, this point has got no coverage whatsoever. I've also been really heartened by the fact that Boris Johnson, who, you know, I don't often praise in this sort of talk, issued a manifesto for public space where he said that there was no need to privatise streets and public places. And actually his manifesto does have legal standing. So in London, that process of privatisation, we can't really test it yet because actually so little new development is going ahead. And what is going ahead received planning permission before his manifesto came out. But, you know, it's policy changes which brought a lot of this stuff about. It's policy changes which can turn the tide. And, you know, that's a sort of a really promising development. I also think the trend towards shared space, which some of you might have heard about, where the controls and railings in a street environment are removed, which is going ahead in parts of London, all around the country. Actually, this was very controversial for highway engineers. They thought, well, you know, we can't take away, you know, fences and traffic lights and what have you. You know, accidents will go up. But in fact, accidents went down, and it creates a far more open, safe environment based on this idea of natural surveillance and unconscious interaction between strangers. Well, you know, my argument would be, if that can happen for traffic and people, why can't it happen for security and people? And I think it's just a question of, you know, getting that debate around security out there a little bit more. However, you know, these do remain minority. When, you know, when I've been sort of describing the main trends of what is happening, you know, there are some sort of hopeful noises as well, but, you know, they're minority voices. Well, this is my last slide, really, and I've called it "There is no alternative," because this was the Thatcherite mantra. You know, we cannot do things any other way. There is no alternative. Well, you know, there really is no alternative to looking for alternatives. You know, the model is the model that I've been describing to you, and the city that it's created, and, you know, the culture that it's created. It's undemocratic and it's economically unviable. So we've really got to look at alternatives, ways of doing things, which are based on a far more balanced local economy, rather than based on property finance underpinned by debt. You know, and if we do have far more balanced local economies, then we'll also start to see the return of identity to places, and far more diverse environments, and in the process we'll start to regain and strengthen democracy and trust and happiness. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Anna, for an incredibly clear and rather challenging and disturbing analysis of where we stand at this very, very moment, incredibly up to date, in terms of the British city and the publicness of the city. So there were loads of issues there, loads of questions that are extremely relevant to Newcastle and to British cities more widely, and we do have some space for comments or questions. So who would like to kick us off? Could I also ask speakers to identify where they're from and when they're asking questions, please? Do we have a volunteer to start the process?
All right, I'm Pete Rogers. I'm from Newcastle, but I did my PhD here on this kind of stuff. But I just had a question. I'm well out of date with British politics because I live in Australia now, and public space is treated very, very differently. But I was watching, of all things, Country File at the weekend, and they had a little section in there about the new planning laws and the relaxation of planning laws on greenfield sites, and which seems to lend itself to exactly the kind of developments you're saying that you're particularly worried about, and the major out-of-town creation of these new sort of commercial cities. So I was just wondering how that sits in with your analysis of the optimism. I think is great, the optimism of what might happen and what we can do, looking for alternatives. But what looks like it's going to happen next looks like it might be worse rather than better.
Oh, so. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the National Planning Policy Framework, you know, which has been the subject of a really big controversy, you know, and it's one of those coalition policies which has come out, you know, been hugely unpopular with so many people, and now the government claim that they're going to look at it again. You know, the extent to which they will look at it again, you know, if health is anything to go by, is probably not very much, and it's really, definitely, really disturbing. I mean, the phrase in the National Planning Policy Framework is that economic benefit, well, I haven't got the exact phrase, but basically economic benefit is the sort of, you know, the main sort of driver. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, the National Trust and Simon Jenkins have got this huge campaign to have that looked at. You know, I would take a deeply pessimistic view of what will result if that bill was to go through unaltered. But I didn't mention it, actually, and I didn't really go into localism in too much detail either, because I want to sort of take an overview. And to be honest, I'm not sure where half of these policies are going to go, if anywhere. So, you know, while, yes, I think it's important to note that, you know, the current planning legislation is going extremely fast in the wrong direction, there are also a lot of people who are very worried about it. And I couldn't tell you where it's going to go. You know, possibly the government won't last, you know, long enough to see it implemented. I really wouldn't be able to say. But yes, certainly, it's very pessimistic. And, you know, I think my presentation is probably too optimistic because I seem to like to end on a kind of positive note. So, yeah, I think that's...
Hi, I'm Robert Hollins from Sociology, Head of Sociology here at Newcastle. Thanks, Anna. I've really enjoyed your talk, and I agree with everything you've said, actually, so I'm struggling for a question. But I wanted to ask you a little bit. You talked about kind of localism, and I'm wondering if part of your argument is that local governments in some sense, find that their kind of hands are tied, not so much through planning, but through this kind of merry-go-round of having to compete, to become, the newly regenerated city. So, the idea that, we've all got to become creative cities and we've all got to do these kinds of things to kind of keep up. So that was one question, just to ask you to say something about kind of local politics. But I suppose the other thing was, you didn't really say too much about this kind of lack of protest other than this idea of kind of social silence. So, I suppose the question is, how do we kind of explain that? We've seen a number of protests about the banking crisis. Why isn't there protest about the kind of what's happening in the places that we kind of live every day? I think that's really interesting as well. So it's kind of a two-part question.
Okay. Well, first part of your question, local government. Yes, you're right. To a large extent, local authorities' hands are tied, and local authorities have been consistently undermined, and brought to a position that they're in today, which is very different from their continental European counterparts, where the public sector is actually taken seriously, and in a city, in continental cities like Amsterdam, planning does go ahead in the public good, with the local authority having a sort of key role, and in this country, it's completely different. I think one of the really big problems is that the local authorities are kind of in the vanguard of this approach. So much of what I've been saying is that this is undermining democracy, and it's undermining local democracy and the great achievements of local democracy, in the past. But actually, local authorities are keen to offload what are their democratic responsibilities. And I think part of the reason for that is that the sector has been, local government has been decimated over the last 25 years. But, that's a sort of an issue that we've got to look at really, really carefully, because, we live in a democracy. We elect MPs to Parliament, we elect councillors to local government. Well, we don't have anyone else. So, local government is not responding as it should do. We need to have a real sort of big national debate about that, because local government is not just that its hands are tied, it doesn't really want to do this stuff. Your next point, lack of protest. Well, there has been some protest, actually, and there's been more and more protest. Well, certainly since I first started writing about these issues, photographers have actually been at the vanguard of all of this, because actually it's photographers who constantly get stopped, because you're not allowed to film or take photographs in these places. So photographers keep getting stopped, and lots of them work for national newspapers, and they're really cross about it. So The Guardian has done a series of big stories about this. It's been on the front page. There is quite a lot of protest around it. I think the protest is undermined by the complexity of the topic, actually, because these are such multidisciplinary areas, and you sort of don't really know where to start. But the photography thing was, sort of quite a clear-cut issue, and that did galvanise a lot of protest. I mean, my big beef really is with newspapers who, have not been interested in covering this sort of agenda. And I think local media is also really important here as well, and local media doesn't play anything like the role it used to play. Local media is owned by, I think NewsQuest, which is a big American corporation, owns something like a third of the local papers in this country, and they no longer have that role, of holding like local government to account. I mean, they do a tiny bit of it, but nothing like they used to. So, I'd put a lot of the blame on the media, and I'd say actually the issue did come out through the media with the photographers, because they were so involved. So it just shows you, how important the media is in communicating, such complicated stories. But, if you saw any of the way that bids were reported when they first started being a policy, it would be some, big story on sort of a wonderful kind of new way of regenerating the city being introduced. There just isn't a critical commentary out there.
Hi, good night. I am an architect from Barcelona, and Montse. I really agree in many things that you say tonight, and I'm afraid I'll add a bit more of pessimism to the atmosphere. But I also noticed that what is happening with public space is also happening with with public services like the GPs, I was incredibly surprised when my GP moved into the booths. I couldn't believe it. So now I have to cross booths to get into the GP, and I think this is a bit in the same direction that which is happening.
Well, soon, Tesco's will be responsible for the whole thing. So, absolutely, completely.
And also, I think from what I noticed in a very informal way, but that the relationship with the public space is completely different than the one in Barcelona. It's about the feeling of belonging doesn't exist here in the same way that exists there. People really feel that the space is for them, even if it's not very well maintained, but they feel that it's their open space, that it's for them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes because it's very controlled here, they don't feel they can do things that they would like to do in it, and that then changes the relationship.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's so true, and I think a lot of it is unintended consequences. The whole sort of, management approach to the city, getting managers in to run places, it wasn't meant to create sterile, over-controlled places that people don't like to be in. It was actually meant to, improve the bottom line, get more people shopping, things that, you might sort of have an argument against. But actually, a lot of this is unintended consequences. What creates a healthy city space? It's about psychology, sociology, so many sort of multidisciplinary factors. And actually, most of those are not thought about by the people who, is a manager the right person to do that?
Questions? Talking about Tesco taking control, I don't know if anyone saw Armando Iannucci's series The Time Trumpet. It's not one of his best known comedies, but he did this scenario in 2030 where Tesco declared war on Denmark. Any more questions or comments?
I'll have to put that in next time.
I might abuse my position here and ask a question about citizenship here. I mean, clearly, a lot of this boils down to what we mean by democracy and citizenship. And I'm struck by some of the efforts in the US to enshrine, I don't know if you've read any of Don Mitchell's work, he's a well-known critic of these processes in the US, a geographer. He talks about this SUV idea of the citizen, which is being enshrined in certain laws, apparently through case law, where it's been decided by judges that you have a sort of bubble around you as you walk around the street in an American city, certain American cities, which is literally legally protected from incursion.
Wow.
Which is based on the sort of notion of being actually protected from beggars, buskers, panhandlers, or whatever.
Wow.
And I'm just wondering here, this is the really chilling concept, the concept that the city has no call on you as a citizen, that you can go about your role as a private individual, a private consumer, without any obligation to engage in that space.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, obviously that's a sort of, really disturbing example, but it also raises another question. I don't think we'd ever see that here. And I'm not sure I'm very glad we'll never see that here, but I think the reason we would never see that here is because we do not have a culture of the rights of the individual in that sense. So, in a way, the fact that we so don't have that culture actually, I think, is one of the things that's behind a lot of what I've been talking about. I think the problem here is that increasingly the concept of citizenship, citizenship, classes, whatever, notions of Britishness, but the idea of the citizen going out in the city, the citizen being someone who is a voter, who elects democratic government, which sort of responds in their interests. I just don't think we've really got that anymore. And the way the citizen is now looked at in the city is as a consumer, and if they're not a consumer, then they're not really taken account of in all of these policies. And actually, I had a debate in a magazine called Building Design about the privatisation of public space with a developer who, his response, his side of the coin, I was just absolutely amazed by it. And I mean, you know, I couldn't have said it better myself. I put it in my new chapter. I mean, he basically said the notion of the citizen is outdated, and the citizen is now a consumer, and basically shopping malls offer the right kind of codes for behaviour, you know, in public. So that's why they have now become the norm. I mean, he said it far better than I could have ever have said it. So, you know, I think we are actually, in a profound sense, losing that notion of the citizen in the city. So that's why I'd say, you know, we wouldn't see what happened in the US happen over here, and I'm glad of that. But you know, the reasons why, you know, the US, you know, we've adopted a lot of their, you know, more destructive policies, but they have a much more vibrant democracy, in part because of their amazing constitution, you know, which we do not have.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, well, perhaps I could ask everyone to express a very warm thanks for such an amazing and insightful lecture from Anna. But I also ask us to thank Anne Fry, who's basically put all of the work into making this possible. Thank you, Anne.